Hey guys, welcome to Nerdarchy, for nerds, by nerds. I'm Nerdarchist Ted, and today I'm hanging out with
Nathan Nerdarch.
Ty Johnston.
And today we're talking swords, realism versus fantasy combat. Jump down to the description below where you can sign up for Nerdarchy, the newsletter. It's a great way to get gaming tips as well as learn how to game with Nerdarchy. So today we have one of our authors from our website and webmaster, Ty Johnston. We're doing Nerdarchy on the road. For those of you who have been following along, Nate the Nerdarch and I have been traveling homeward bound from our cruise, Fan 2C.
Which was awesome.
Which was fantastic. And Ty has traveled hours out of his way to come meet with us and do some interviews.
Not that many, couple.
Yeah, a few. And just for anybody who's freaking out at home, they have the tips of the sword pieces on their feet. On top of their shoe, so that we're not sticking them into the ground. I know some people are like, no.
Well, and this one's just plastic.
Yeah,
hard
all
plastic.
right.
So some of you out there who are familiar with Nerdarchy know that the three of us have actually done some version or some amount of real medieval sword fighting training, however you want to call it. I did ARMA, Association of Renaissance Martial Arts, for about 8 years. Ty, what's your...
I've done HEMA for a couple of years. I've been off about 6 months now, though.
Well, I've been off for about 2 years, so I'm very much out of practice.
And years ago, decades ago, I had a little rapier training back in college.
I
but
had,
very different.
I had like a night of rapier training. Our ARMA group, we actually went and did a travel to somewhere that had a rapier school, and they just kind of walked us through some of it, so we could see a different version of sword fighting.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. There's some things that do cross over, and there's some things that absolutely don't.
Yeah.
Now, Nate, you...
I've had about 2 years, and I've had plenty of years of foam fighting with foam fighting swords.
Yes.
But,
we gotta love the
that's
LARP
another
fighting.
conversation.
And there's stuff that I had to be very much schooled out of LARP practice because it was bad for real fighting.
Yeah. Speaking of real fighting.
So real fighting, you're using a weapon, and this thing barely fits in the shot here. This is about the size of what you would refer to as a longsword, a bastard sword. It's got a number of different names. And this thing, as you can see, has no problem with me wielding this in one hand. And it's a situation that a lot of you guys out there who are gamers, you imagine these great swords with blades that are like 3 foot wide and 16 feet long, and you're trying to wield them, and they're cumbersome.
Especially the more anime influenced of us.
That's true.
Absolutely. Now, a sword is best used in 1.5 hands, as they would call it, because it gives you the best of both worlds, because with one hand you have more reach by being able to come to the edge of your sword or the edge of your grip, as well as being able to get the most amount of power by swinging with 2 hands. In fantasy combat, whether you're talking in books, movies, whatever have you, all kinds of craziness ensues. But there's nothing to say that you couldn't take the mechanics of real world combat and import that into your game. Right?
I agree.
Now, you DM as well as play, or just DM?
I do both,
Okay.
DM and play.
So, how much of your HEMA training would you say inspires your narrative while you're DMing?
As I DMing, probably not quite as much as it does when I'm a player.
Okay.
Because when I'm a player, you think differently.
I 100% agree with you.
Dungeon Master, I'm more thinking about background and not just one individual character. Background, story, a team of characters. But when I'm a player, I'm worried about my character for the most part. That's it. And I've definitely used what I've learned from HEMA, half sorting and things like that, as a player character from time to time. I won't say it would never come up as a Dungeon Master, but for the most part, I don't, and part of the reason I don't use HEMA tactics is as a Dungeon Master is because my guess would be most of my players would not be familiar with it.
Okay.
So, one, it would kind of lose the coolness factor if they don't know what I'm talking about. And two, I'd be concerned that some of them might think I'm trying to pull a fast one on them. You know, it's
Okay.
like, oh, you're pulling some fancy moves that aren't part of the game or aren't real or something like that. You know.
And it's always great when you pull something out of history and someone says, well, that's not possible or that's not real. And it's like, this is how you do it.
Yeah, this is what happened. Yeah.
You know, I specifically love in Star Wars Phantom Menace when Obi-Wan and Darth Maul are fighting, and there's maneuvers that Obi-Wan is doing that I'm like, I know how to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I know I've had conversations with friends about the styles of sword fighting that are used throughout the Star Wars movies, and they're different. You know, the original movies, 4, 5, and 6, were probably more like Kendo or Kenjutsu, a little more Eastern flair, whereas the prequels there was a lot more fancier dance kind of stuff there,
Well,
but there was
martial arts itself had become more widespread
Yes.
and more accessible, as well as the technology to kind of go along with it. So it's like, oh, well, we can do that. The actual scope of Star Wars was expanded by the
Yes.
new trilogy, as well as they took into account the athleticism of the individuals involved.
true.
The guy who
The
played Count,
ages. Yeah.
the guy who played Count Dooku, he was not going to be able to do the stuff that Obi-Wan Kenobi could do. He was younger. He was more spry and limber. So Count Dooku, he was more of a rapier cut and thrust type fighter, and to go along with it, they also did camera maneuvers to not have to have that actor move as much
Yeah.
as the one for Obi-Wan.
Well, that's one reason why I'm sure why the Emperor used the Force lightning so much, because he wasn't going to be able to go easily toe to toe with somebody who's like a fourth of his age, and you know, even if he might be more powerful technically speaking, there's just practical considerations.
And then you get into the magic of it as well, or the
Yes.
Force with Star Wars, and you know, it was fun. I enjoyed the fight scenes of Star Wars.
Oh, I've enjoyed all of them. At least in my opinion, in the more recent films, not so much Rogue One because there's not a lot of lightsaber action going on there.
That is indeed true.
But prior to that,
Oh, there's enough for me.
there's enough for you. Oh, okay, there's one or two really good scenes.
what
I'll
you,
give
what
you
you
that.
see is
I
definitely...
think I've noticed a shift more towards more of a Western kind of flair,
Mm-hmm.
but that could be coincidence for a number of factors. One, you don't have Jedi running around all over the place anymore. Two, it could just be a visual thing because, you know, Kylo Ren's lightsaber has
Yeah.
side
it's-
guards.
what we would call side guards or cross guards.
Yeah, it's more of like a Crusader style weapon.
Yeah, it's definitely more of that kind of look.
And
to
from the perspective of the writers, he's got a broken kyber shard, so therefore his lightsaber handle needs to vent that incorrect energy, but it creates those cross guards. So in essence, they are little lightsaber blades, and therefore they're going to function the same way. So therefore, not that you can half sword it, but you know, if you
Yeah.
could, you can still
Yeah.
jab.
Well,
you know.
getting back to gaming real quick and half sorting, that's definitely something I've used in gaming because I know there've been once or twice like I would have a character with a big two-handed sword or a long sword, and he's in some tight confines, maybe a tunnel or something like that that's kind of narrow, and the DM's like, oh, you can't use your long sword. I'm like, yes, I can. Let me show you. It's called half sorting. You know, if I can't, you know, for those who don't know, you're basically kind of using a longer sword, sort of spear-like. Would
Yeah.
be the way to do
Well,
it.
it's in essence a couple different things.
Yeah.
So typically, you know, yes, you're going to hold your sword, and depending upon where you want your flip, I guess you would call it, you can position your hands anywhere along your guard. This gives you the most torque for spinning. You know, it does a lot. But if you're going to half sword, you tend to grip about halfway up your blade, and you're literally gripping the flat part of the blade, and you're trying to keep the edge off your fingers. If you're using a sword, you probably have leather or metal gauntlets on to stop you from getting cut. And what will wind up happening is you have got a smaller sword that you can work with, but at the same time, you have got the ability to block an incoming strike, and at the same time, as the opponent's sword would hit here, you could come in and smack with a pommel, smack with a pommel, smack with a crossguard. You could literally just bring the whole blade right into their face. The advance of weaponry was kind of done in regards to what kind of armor your opponent was wearing. So a lot of people see in movies big metal armor and the guy just sits there and he runs them through. That's not typically the way it worked.
Yes.
Your pommel and your crossguard were designed to batter that armor into inusability or what have you, so that your opponent was less able to fight. You could knock them on the ground, flip up the visor, and stab them in the face. There are times in historical pictures where they completely flip it over and they turn their sword into a hammer or a mace and totally just batter their opponent. A lot of the misconceptions of people who are unfamiliar with historical swords, they think from crossguard to tip, it's razor sharp. There's no need for that. There was no call to have all of that sharpened. So like I could honestly do this and I would not be getting cut because I'm not going to come in here and try to cut you with this part of the sword. It's ridiculous. You're going to have this part, your top third be sharpened because that's where your sweet spot is, right in here. That's where you want to hit, and you're going to get the most amount of impact. If you want to thrust, well then your tip should hopefully be going through.
And a lot of times, even though you have a two-edged sword, still a lot of times one side would be sharper than the other would be. Because literally, in practice, you're using an inside stroke or inside edge and an outside edge.
Right.
And the outside edge, in general, is mostly for binding and blocking and that kind of thing. Not always, but in general. You can cut with it if need to. But yeah, a lot of times what we sort of think of as the inside edge, or what you might refer to as the attacker's edge, is going to be sharper, at least from about halfway on down than the outside would be. And as you were pointing out, the whole weapon is a weapon. Yeah, it's not just from here on down. Even at close quarters, as long as you're on your feet, maybe even otherwise, like say with Nate here, even if he's got a dagger, this close it would seem like my sword's not very useful. Well, that's not very true. I could punch him in the face.
Yeah.
You can do a whole lot of damage with these. Put them in the throat, put them in the eye.
And you could have different designs on your crossguard.
That's true too.
I've seen everything from just a spiked point, and so from it close, that can go right into the face, no problems. I've seen the big bulbous, essentially hammerheads that are designed to honestly wail on your opponent. But every aspect of your weapon needs to be a weapon, and it's going to be something that you also need to take into account the weight of the entire weapon. Now with fantasy combat, that's not a big deal. A lot of people want, I want my hammer to have this huge freaking head
All
on
these
it.
double-bladed axes that are like,
If you look at the Viking bearded axe, you honestly have a blade that's like this. These huge blades that you see on these fantasy axes, they look cool, but they're not very practical.
No, and even when it comes to swords, most of your extremely large swords generally weren't used in combat. They were generally more of a ceremonial purpose or something like that. And even then, say something that's taller than any of us are by a good means, it's still at most going to weigh maybe 7 or 8 pounds, maybe. I mean, what you've got there is about a 3.5 pound thing.
And this is a good weight for me. Now, I'm certainly not as strong as these strapping gentlemen here, but I could wield this for a while and not get tired. So this is about the weight of a standard longsword. You try and make it a full metal greatsword that is reminiscent of William Wallace. His sword was a little bit longer than this, and it was definitely thicker than this, but it was definitely more historical in creation. It wasn't Cloud's Buster sword that you wind up seeing in video games. Now, speaking to what you're talking about with close quarter, if I've got my weapon sheathed on my offside and somebody actually comes in, there's nothing to prevent me from drawing right into their face or drawing into a block, and as they reel back, I get the full draw, and before they recover, I've got the weapon pointed right at their face. So there's lots of different maneuvers and things that you can do based on historical fighting styles and mix them into your fantasy combat to make them more narrative, make them more interesting. And there's plenty of manuals and stuff that's out there. There's plenty of ways that you can go get that information, and I'm certain that I could go on for hours and hours on the different on the different things that I've done. Before we wrap this one up, I know everybody has a different design on hit points, and some people say that hit points represent how tough and sturdy you are and this and that, but it becomes unrealistic to be like, you took an arrow through the midsection and a sword through your arm, and you're still fighting without any kind of problems.
Yeah.
So some RPGs does say that hit points represents your endurance, and once you've gotten through that and you get hit, that's when you really take a good shot. That's when you've been run through, and that's when you're lying on the ground possibly dying. So I don't know what your opinion is on that, how you handle in your game.
Well, to be honest, for the most part, I just do it like the typical player's handbook in DMG. Hit points are your hit points. I tend to think of it as it's not very realistic, but the majority of players, in my experience, aren't usually worried about that. Now, if you're trying to set up a specific campaign or a specific session or sessions that wants to focus more on that realism, well, there are a few rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide which can help with that. And there's various home rules you can come up with. I know there's an old game back in the very early 80s called Dragon Quest, which back in the early days of D&D even, that I used to play, and that game broke down what we call hit points into two different parts. There was endurance, and then there was the equivalent of hit points. And endurance would kind of be like a constitution would be, and you could take them, like, I'm going to convert this to sort of D&D, modern D&D terms, but let's say you rolled a natural 20 and you do your double damage, it would immediately come out of endurance, or in D&D terms, it would immediately come out of your constitution instead of the hit points. So one or two good hits and your 20th level fighter could go down fairly quickly. So in some ways that makes it more realistic, but then that can open up some other issues. You don't want your 20th level fighter, at least you're the player, you don't want your 20th level fighter being taken down by the first level
Goblin.
kobold or goblet or whatever. But
so one of the things that I do on occasion, it's something to use sparingly, is that's to set up a situation where, all right, the player has attacked and done damage, or the monster has attacked and done damage to the player, and the narrative that I sometimes use is that, all right, you have done a successful block, but it required a hasty maneuver or something that speaks to the fact that you had to try really hard, or that you had the wind knocked out of you. It's like, all right, this coming in the last second, you managed to get a parry out of the way, and the strength of the incoming blow reels through your arms. You avoid the strike, but your arms are now more tired because you've done that. So that's one way of representing damage taking and being a little bit more realistic.
And I would say in 5th edition that shows in the way that you can take a short rest and gain hit points back.
Yeah.
Just by spending your hit dice.
Because you're not run through, you're not covered in all these tiny little scratches.
Having gaping wounds everywhere.
You're just like you're winded. Now, when you go to HEMA and you spar, how long does it take before you feel like you could go again?
It depends on how long I'm sparring, but
10 minutes of sparring, 5 minutes of sparring.
at least 10 minutes of resting. But keep in mind, I'm an older guy too.
So if you, in essence, took a short rest in D&D 5th edition standards, that's an hour, you'd be good to go, right?
Oh, I should be.
So there you go. So that's one way to denote that combat can tire you out, it can drain your hit points, but you spend those hit dice and you're ready to go.
And along the lines you were talking about blocking a weapon, I have seen a number of Dungeon Masters, and I've done it myself a few times, that when you're hit, you still take the hit point damage, though maybe blood wasn't drawn. There's a good hit in your armor, you got a bruise, or you got the wind knocked out of you, but you're not bleeding out or anything like that.
Yeah, if you block a great sword with your shield, it's even if it's a glancing blow, it's still going to jar your arm.
Yeah. You might have a little tendonitis or something like that.
Yeah, and you're probably like
Yeah,
the
or
sound.
your ears ringing, your helmet
Yeah.
got hit or something.
Oh yeah, a good ding on the helmet might not, you're not going to draw blood, but it's going to knock you a little bit.
Yeah.
And you're not going to be as effective in combat as you previously were. So you get down to 10 hit points in your 100 hit point fighter, it's just one more good sword swing is going to do you in because you're just going to be a little too slow getting that block
Yeah,
up.
you're exhausted.
Or a little too slow dodging that head strike.
Absolutely.
And that's when the blood will show up.
Yep, and that's when you're
the
going to
blood
get
shows up.
clobbered.
Yeah.
That's when you fall on the ground.
Yep.
So, what are you guys doing out there to add realism into your fantasy combat? What what kind of stories do you have? Go ahead and put them down in the comments below. While you're at it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
You can check us out over at Patreon and patronize us in a good way.
So, until next time,
Stay
stay
nerdy.
nerdy.